This is the story of Sumer, the place where the first cities rose, where writing on clay tablets was invented, and where civilization itself began. More than 5,000 years ago, humanity left behind the wandering paths of hunters and gatherers and learned how to live in an organized way. It was an age so ancient that it's hard to picture. As the Sumerians were building temples, much of the planet was still home to hunters. So long ago that, even after Sumer vanished, the last mammoths survived for another 350 years. What we now take for granted, time divided into hours and minutes, schools, laws, was born here. They were men and women like us, with hopes and fears, who discovered how to organize themselves in the face of a relentless world. But where did the Sumerians come from? And how could such a powerful civilization disappear and be forgotten for millennia? In their poetry and their laments, we hear the heartbeat of that ancient world. I have stretched out my hands to the god An. I have directed my cries to Enlil. Yet the storm does not retreat. The gods have abandoned Ur. They have hidden in distant places. This documentary takes us from the mysterious origins of Sumerian civilization to its tragic end. One of humanity's most captivating stories. Chapter 1: The Enigma of the Sumerian People. After An, Enlil and Enki had created the black-headed people, they built cities in pure places. Genesis of Eridu. 6,000 years ago, in the fertile plains of Mesopotamia, an unknown people began reshaping the course of human history. In their writings, when the Sumerians wanted to refer to themselves, they used the phrase black-headed people. There is no certainty, but it was likely a self-description, dark-haired people distinguishing themselves from neighboring groups. Their language was unique, with no relation to any other known tongue, suggesting they may have come from somewhere else. Some scholars believe they were heirs of older cultures like the Ubaid, gradually transforming villages into cities. It was a slow evolution rather than a sudden arrival. Yet this idea leaves the mystery of their language unanswered. Another theory suggests the first Sumerians came by sea, sailing through the Persian Gulf from an unknown land. Accounts passed down centuries later by Berosus, a Babylonian priest, tell of an extraordinary being, Oannes. Half fish and half man, Oannes would rise at dawn to live among humans and teach them. He taught them to plant and harvest, to build temples and organize cities, to inscribe signs on clay. To a modern reader, Oannes appears mythical. But what if he was a symbolic memory of something real? Leaders and priests from a distant land might have brought to Mesopotamia the knowledge of a lost civilization. A more dramatic hypothesis speaks of a drowned valley, a great flood. It suggests the Sumerians fled a fertile land now submerged beneath the Persian Gulf. Their obsession with the myth of a great flood may have been a cultural memory of this real disaster. On their tablets, they left us the story of Ziusudra, the pious king warned by the gods of the end. He was ordered to build a massive ark and place within it the seed of every living creature. For 7 days and 7 nights, a colossal storm unleashed chaos. The tempest roared over the land, and the thunder was so terrible that even the gods could not endure the sight. They fled, ascended to the highest heaven of Anu, and huddled against the wall, trembling like dogs. Geology lends support to this idea. When the last ice age ended around 12,000 years ago, melting glaciers caused sea levels to rise. The region's once fertile farmlands were completely submerged, and survivors experienced it as the end of the world. They moved north toward the lands of the Tigris and Euphrates, carrying with them the memory of their catastrophe. Today, most experts believe there was not a single migration, but rather a gradual meeting of peoples. Perhaps the errors of the Ubaid culture were already there, and at some point another group arrived with new knowledge. In time, the blending of these roots sparked the birth of Sumerian civilization, the first great epic of humankind. Chapter 2: The Geographical Miracle of Mesopotamia. The great god Enki set his eyes upon the 2 rivers. He filled the Tigris with fresh, sparkling water, and called it the water that advances. To the Euphrates he gave abundance, making it the bearer of all life. Myth of Enki. To understand the Sumerians, we must first look at the world that shaped them, a land of extreme and unexpected gifts. It all begins high in the mountains of what we now call Turkey and Iran. The melting ice released torrents that found each other until they became 2 giants, the Tigris and the Euphrates. Each flood was both a promise and a threat. At times, it destroyed entire villages. Other times, it left behind a blanket of fertile mud that turned the earth into a great garden. Where many only saw unstable marshes, the Sumerians saw the chance to plant grain. Perhaps the pressure of this environment was what drove the greatness of the first human civilization. An environment filled with serious challenges, but not impossible ones, forces people to come together and develop new technologies. They mixed mud with straw, pressed it into wooden molds to shape it into bricks, and let them dry under the sun. With those bricks, they built their houses, their temples, and their storehouses. To face the unpredictability of the rivers, they took the next step. They dug canals to carry water to the fields. The work must have been brutal, digging under a merciless sun while living in constant fear of the next flood. For the Sumerians, these floods were the signs of capricious and often furious gods. Against mysterious forces like storm and drought, they imagined powerful deities who ruled them. At the top stood An, the god of the starry sky, a supreme yet distant figure. The most feared was his son, Enlil, lord of the storm, who unleashed the devastating floods of the rivers. Against his fury, humanity had a protector, Enki, the clever god of wisdom and fresh water. According to Sumerian myths, the gods, weary of digging canals, decided to create a being to do the work for them: man. In the poem of Atrahasis, a Babylonian work inspired by Sumerian thought, we read the divine purpose for humanity. "O my mother, create a substitute for the gods, so they may lay down their baskets of labor. Create a servant, Lulu Amelu, who can bear the yoke. Let man carry the work of the gods." Thus, for the Sumerians, every brick they shaped, every canal they dug, was an act of devotion. But they were about to discover that the true reward for their effort was something far more revolutionary. Chapter 3: The Revolution of Crops. The great god Enki stood over the furrow. He filled the field with rich barley, and so that humanity could prosper, he gave them the plow and the yoke. Enki and the order of the world. A single person could not dig a canal. It required the entire village working together. They needed leaders who could plan where the canals should go and direct the laborers. In the so-called Farmer's Almanac, a father gives his son detailed instructions. When you plow your field, make sure the water does not rise too much over the surface. After you have drained the field of water, let the damp earth dry under the sun. Let your plow smooth it all out, and let your hose tear up the weeds. This mastery over the land unleashed the first great revolution in history. Intensive agriculture could feed hundreds of families. And a surplus of grain meant something new: occupations beyond farming, such as craftsmen, potters, or priests. Each family gave a portion of their harvest to the temple as tribute. Grain became food and stored wealth. The temple was the dwelling of a deity. Much like a mud brick house, but larger than all the others. And with wealth came power. Whoever controlled the distribution of rations held the fate of everyone. In the beginning of Sumer, this figure was the priest king called En, or Ensi, mediator between heaven and earth. Over time, life began to revolve around the temples, and more houses and workshops sprang up around them. The village was fading away to give birth to something new, something more complex than anything known before. Chapter 4: Eridu, the Seed of Civilization. No holy city had yet been built, no dwelling for the gods had been raised. All the land was sea. Then Eridu was founded. Genesis of Eridu. Among all the communities, one stood out, which the Sumerians pointed to as the very first center of creation: Eridu. Scribes inscribed it in the Sumerian king list as the place where civilization was given to humankind. The text proclaims with mythical solemnity, when kingship descended from heaven, kingship was first in Eridu. And the first king on this list was Alulim, to whom the Sumerians attributed a reign of nearly 30,000 years. This fantastic age is a hallmark of Sumerian mythology. They divided their history into two great periods, before and after the flood. The antediluvian world was seen as an almost perfect time. The reigns of kings stretched immensely long, symbolizing a golden age. At first, Eridu was only a small settlement in the marshes of southern Mesopotamia. Over time, they built a temple dedicated to Enki, god of wisdom and of the underground waters. The choice of Enki was no accident. For the Sumerians, beneath the earth flowed the Abzu, a vast ocean of fresh water, the source of all life. And Eridu was the place where that hidden world and the human world touched. Thus, for the Sumerians, Eridu was the ground zero of their civilization, the spot where divine order reached the earth. But not far away, a new force was rising, a city far greater, filled with ambition and power. Chapter 5: Uruk, the first city of humanity. Behold its walls, which gleam like copper. Touch the threshold from time immemorial. Climb up and walk along the wall of Uruk. Inspect its foundations, examine its bricks. Epic of Gilgamesh. Around 5,500 years ago, on the banks of the Euphrates, a settlement not so different from others began to grow rapidly. It would become something humanity had never seen before: Uruk, the first city in history. Tens of thousands of flat-roofed houses crowded together in a maze of narrow, winding alleys. Ancient chronicles claimed that Uruk was surrounded by a wall, built under the orders of King Gilgamesh. Perhaps not all of it is legend. Archaeologists have uncovered remains of enormous fortifications that once protected the city. For the first time, a community saw itself as separate from the outside world, in need of defense. At its height, as many as 50,000 people may have lived in Uruk, a concentration of humanity unmatched for millennia. The secret to this growth lay in its privileged location, Next to the Euphrates, Uruk controlled both irrigation and trade. Fields sustained tens of thousands of people, while temples gathered wealth and authority. Donkeys loaded with grain made their way through narrow alleys under scorching, dust-filled heat. Metal workers hammered away and stonecutters shaped blocks. Women molded clay vessels in potters' workshops. Merchants shouted in the markets offering dried fish, dates, or barley beer. This density of people created tension, but it also sparked creativity. Here arose writing, applied mathematics, the first laws, and the earliest epic tales. Above that sea of dwellings, two monumental complexes rose toward the sky. They were the houses of the gods, but also the economic and political engines of the city. The most important was the Temple of Heaven, dedicated to Inanna, goddess of love, fertility, and war. It was a temple complex that stood at the heart of Uruk. In a hymn, the Sumerians sang of her power. In the great sanctuary of heaven and earth, she is Inanna, lady who arises bright as day, torch that fills the sky and lights the earth. Your place is Uruk, the great sheepfold. Nearby stood the ziggurat of Anu, the sky god. On its summit rose the White Temple, so named for its gleaming white walls that shone beneath the sun. Its purpose was to lift the temple closer to the heavens, creating a link between the earthly and the divine. Amid the bustle of the markets, a new problem emerged. Human memory was not enough. In Uruk, necessity gave birth to something immortal. Chapter 6: The Rise of Writing. The enormous size of Uruk brought with it a pressing problem. How could so many people be governed? How could the grain of the temples be counted? A new technology was needed, one that did not yet exist. Out of sheer necessity, the Sumerians of Uruk invented it. At first, they used clay tokens to represent goods, kept inside sealed balls as contracts. Later, they began pressing the tokens onto tablets, transforming them into recorded symbols. Over time, those drawings were simplified into wedge-shaped marks. Cuneiform writing had been born. It was the true Big Bang of history. For the first time, human thought could be fixed onto a physical object. Spoken words die, but written words are immortal. With them, it became possible to count grain, draft laws, and record myths. On one of the earliest tablets from Uruk, we find an astonishing testimony to this new power. In a record of a barley transaction, the scribe signed as Kushim, the first known written name of a person. Kushim was the first individual to emerge from the shadows of prehistoric anonymity, not a king, but an accountant. Writing became so sacred that it was given its own goddess, Nisaba. The scribes sang to her, Nisaba, lady of radiant brilliance, woman whose knowledge none can undo. You carry the great tablets of the gods. You guard their secrets, and you mark their destinies. Writing gave birth to an idea that would forever change human relationships: formal private property. Before writing, possession was based on the tangible. Something belonged to someone because it was in their hands. But a clay tablet could declare that a field or a house belonged to a person. Soon within Uruk itself, other astonishing inventions would emerge. Human ingenuity would no longer stop. Chapter 7: Uruk, the Laboratory of History. The art of the scribe is the brightest of all. With it, the sky is measured, the earth is counted, and the king's granaries are divided. Sumerian school text. The concentration of thousands of minds in Uruk sparked an explosion of creativity unlike anything before. Around 3500 BC, in the workshops of artisans, a groundbreaking invention appeared: the wheel. They placed the clay on a flat spinning wheel and shaped vessels with their hands as it turned. With it, an artisan could produce dozens of vessels in the time it once took to craft a single one. Over time, the wheel was attached to an axle and a wooden platform. This is how the first cart was born. Harvests could now be moved with far less effort, and goods were traded across distances once unimaginable. Feeding Uruk's immense population required more than hard labor. It demanded intelligent labor. The solution came in the form of the animal-drawn plow, the ard. Before this, soil was broken by hand with hoes, slow and exhausting work. By attaching a wooden blade to a yoke pulled by oxen, a single farmer could till a far larger field in far less time. This sparked an agricultural revolution that generated a massive surplus of grain, the wealth that sustained the city. For the Sumerians, such tools were divine gifts. In the hymn to the hoe, they sang with awe. The hoe, made of gold and with a beard of lapis lazuli. The hoe that builds cities, the hoe that makes them great. O hoe, decree of the great god Enlil, you are the one who secures the fate of the land of Sumer. In a village, trade relied on trust. But how could commerce work in a city? The answer was standardization. Fixed units of measure were born: the sila to measure grain, the mina to weigh wool and metals, and the cubit to raise the walls of temples. To manage this new order, a universal language was needed: mathematics. The Sumerians devised a clever sexagesimal system based on the number 60. They chose it for its practicality. 60 has many divisors, making fractions and the division of goods easier to calculate. Every day we use the Sumerian legacy, the measure of time and the circle: 60 minutes, 60 seconds, 360 degrees, was born in Sumer. For millennia, humanity lived between stone and wood. In Mesopotamia, scarce in such materials, necessity sharpened ingenuity. Uruk's artisans learned to work copper. At first, they hammered it cold to craft small tools, but the great leap came with the mastery of fire. They discovered how to smelt copper in furnaces and cast it into axes and knives. By mixing it with tin, they created bronze, a material even stronger. The wheel, the plow, and metals sustained a city. But to truly understand Uruk, one must step inside its homes. Chapter 8: A Day in the House of Uruk. Come, 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 sleep. Come to my child. Hurry and rest upon my child. Let his restless eyes be calmed. But your crying awakens the god of this house. The god of this home cannot sleep. This fragment of a Sumerian song from about 4,000 years ago, considered the oldest known lullaby. We hear both the human love of a mother for her baby and the Sumerian belief in a world surrounded by deities. To truly understand the Sumerians, we must step away from palaces and temples and enter the family home. The streets of Uruk are a maze of narrow, unpaved alleys. Houses are pressed tightly together, built from sun-dried mud brick. From the outside, they look like modest fortresses, with small doors and almost no windows. Yet, once across the threshold, the world changes. The Sumerian home is organized around an open-air central courtyard. The day of Ur-Nammu, a pot, begins long before sunrise. In the courtyard, his wife Ninana strains to move one heavy stone over another, grinding barley grains. Ur-Nammu, as head of the household, prepares to leave, but first offers a prayer to Utu, the god who brings order to the world. O Utu, who rises from the great mountain, you who light up the darkness and deliver justice, clear my path, let my judgments be fair, and brighten my steps in the night. Their 10-year-old son, Lugal, watches knowing that today he will follow his father into the small workshop attached to the house. When the men leave, the home belongs to Ninana, who spins wool, tends to the goat, and keeps the fire alive. In the quiet of her work, she may recall an old Sumerian proverb. A loving heart builds a home. A heart filled with hate destroys it. By evening, the family gathers again. It is time for the main meal. A stew of lentils and onions with flatbread. After the meal, by the light of an oil lamp, comes the hour of leisure. It is the grandfather's time, the keeper of memory. He recounts the feats of the great king Gilgamesh, but also passes on wisdom, the advice a father gives to his son. Do not sit in the square without having eaten first. When a man's stomach is empty, his judgment is clouded. As silence falls over Uruk, the elders climb to the rooftop to sleep beneath the stars. The world of spirits awakens. The greatest fear is Lamashtu, the demon goddess who feeds on newborns. It was believed she slipped into houses at night to snatch infants from their cradles and drink their blood. Urnamu checks the amulet of the demon Pazuzu hanging near where little Inanna Sarat sleeps. Pazuzu was another demon, but his hatred of Lamashtu was so fierce that humans hung amulets bearing his face. It was these families, with their fears of demons and their love of each other, who truly built the first civilization. And, to survive that invisible battle, the Sumerians created spells and exorcisms. Chapter 9: The Supernatural World. Ghosts, Exorcists, and Magic. Listen, demon. Do not come near. Leave his body. Flee through the window like a serpent. Go to the desolate desert, where no living creature dwells, and the sun does not shine. Depart now! This is one of the magical texts Sumerian exorcists used to drive out demons, such as Lamashtu. For the ancient Sumerians, the world was inhabited by a legion of invisible beings. As feared as the demons were, the ghosts of the dead, the Gadim. If a body was not properly buried, the spirit of the deceased became a creature tormented by eternal hunger and thirst. It was believed that a ghost could bring nightmares and madness, trying to drain away vital energy. When illness could not be cured with herbs, people did not call a physician, but an Ashipu, the exorcist. This fragment is a representation of the exorcist incantations, a series of texts inscribed on clay tablets. You, wandering ghost who has fallen from the sky without a name, you have taken hold of this man. You make his flesh shiver and his teeth chatter. By the power of the great gods, I command you to depart. And there was another specialist whose work was even more complex, reading the future to ward off misfortune. This was the domain of the Baru, a scholar who practiced divination by examining the liver of a sacrificed sheep. The liver was seen as a text where the gods wrote their answers to questions of war or politics. The sheep's liver provided immediate responses, but the gods also spoke with another, far older voice, the stars. Chapter 10: Readers of Constellations. Sumerian Astronomy. From the tops of the ziggurats, priest astronomers watched the sky night after night for centuries. They believed the movements of the moon, the sun, and the visible planets revealed the fate of empires. They recorded the positions of planets, the exact rising and setting of Venus, and every unusual event. Their goal was to find patterns, links of cause and effect. To them, nothing happened by chance. If a lunar eclipse was followed by a flood, it was written down as a possible omen. Across generations, they compiled long lists of portents, like the Enuma Anu Enlil, filled with terse, ominous lines. If in the month of Nisanu, the setting sun appears yellow, there will be an outbreak of plague in the land. If a halo surrounds the moon and Jupiter is inside it, the king will be besieged in his palace. And in their search for divine messages, the astronomers stumbled upon something they had not set out to find: the mathematics of the universe. They discovered that Earth, the Moon, and the Sun returned to the same geometric position every 18 years, 11 days, and 8 hours. To chart the path of the Sun across the heavens, they divided its yearly journey into 12 segments. Without realizing it, they had just invented the zodiac, a map of the sky we still use today. But how was this knowledge passed on? That is where the story of the world's first school begins. Chapter 11: The First Educational System. There is a house. One enters it blind and leaves it seeing. What is it? Sumerian riddle. Cuneiform writing was a revolutionary invention, but it was useless if no one knew how to use it. The bureaucracy of temples and palaces required a constant supply of experts capable of reading and writing. Out of this need, the school was born. The Sumerians called it the Aduba, the House of Tablets. Groups of children and teenagers, mostly boys from wealthy families, sat with their damp clay tablets. The teacher, or Umia, a high-ranking scribe, led the lesson. Beside him, an older student helped prepare the tablets. Learning was grueling, built on endless repetition of signs and long lists of words. Discipline was harsh, thanks to a text known as School Days. We can hear the voice of a student complaining. My teacher read the tablet and said, "Things are missing," and he beat me. The monitor of silence said, "Why are you speaking without permission?" and he beat me. After years of mastering the basics, the Aduba became the world's first center of higher education. They studied mathematics, applying the sexagesimal system, or literature, preserving the great myths of creation. They memorized formulas for drafting marriage contracts, commercial agreements, or judicial rulings. Becoming a scribe guaranteed a life of influence. It was said, "The art of the scribe is the father of orators and the mother of teachers." For the first time in history, human knowledge no longer relied solely on memory. It could be passed down through generations. But only a select few could rise through writing, while the majority remained at the base of the social pyramid. Chapter 12: The Sumerian Social Pyramid, From Kings to Slaves. For the Sumerians, hierarchy was not seen as an injustice, but as the very order of the world, a reflection of divine hierarchy. At the top of the pyramid stood the leaders of the city, the Lugal, the warrior king, or the Ansi, the priest-governor, and their families. Alongside them, the elite included high priests, army commanders, and high-ranking scribes. They owned most of the land, controlled the wealth of the temples, and enjoyed the full protection of the law. The majority of the population were farmers, artisans, fishermen, and low-ranking soldiers. They worked land that did not belong to them in exchange for a share of the harvest. At the very bottom of society were the Arad, male slaves, and the Gemi, female slaves. In the eyes of the law, they were not considered people, but property. They were bought and sold, and marked to show ownership. Chapter 13. The Sacred Contract: Marriage and Family. At the heart of society stood the patriarchal family, ruled by the father, the legal owner of the household. Marriage was understood as a legal contract and a business arrangement between two families, meant to produce heirs and unite resources. In the Instructions of Shurpak, one of the oldest surviving texts, a father advises his son, "My son, do not marry a woman whose husbands are many. Do not marry a temple slave, for she is dedicated to a god. Marry a woman of your own choosing, whose heart brings you joy." The groom's family paid a bride price, compensating for the loss of a daughter's labor. In return, the bride's father provided her with a dowry, which could include jewelry, land, or even personal slaves. Yet, not everything was transactional. In a fragment of a poem, we glimpse profound affection. "Disease has taken hold of my wife, the one who gladdened my heart. The light of my eyes has gone out." A wife's primary duty was to produce an heir, preferably a son. Infertility was considered a tragedy. The law allowed a husband to take a second wife if the first failed to conceive, ensuring the continuation of his lineage. Still, not all women fit into the role of wife. Some rose to positions of power. The Naditu, elite priestesses, were dedicated to temples and remained without husband or children. They bought and sold land, lent silver with interest, and managed estates. At the top of society, queens and princesses wielded significant influence. Queen Puabi of Ur is a striking example. Her cylinder seal identifies her as Nin, or queen, without mention of any king, leading some to believe she may have ruled alone. The ultimate proof of her immense power lies in the grim retinue that accompanied her in death. In a pit beside her tomb lay the bodies of dozens sacrificed to follow the queen into the afterlife. Chapter 14. Proverbs, Jokes, and Fables, Sumerian Wisdom. There exists a literary treasure that offers us an intimate and honest glimpse into the Sumerian mind. It is the so-called literature of wisdom, thousands of proverbs used to educate young scribes. Many of these proverbs speak of the harsh reality of work and poverty, often with a sense of fatalism. The poor man is better off dead than alive. If he has bread, he has no salt. If he has salt, he has no bread. And if he has meat, he has no lamb. In another reflection, we see how extreme poverty can bring a strange kind of peace. He who has much silver can be happy. He who has much barley can be happy. But he who has nothing at all can sleep. Another proverb captures how the Sumerians managed to build their civilization. One hand working builds a house. Two hands working together build a city. Their view of authority was deeply cynical. They knew exactly who held the real power in society. You may have a master, you may have a king, but the man you truly need to fear is the tax collector. They also showed sharp insight into human nature. To describe someone arrogant, they would say, "A fox peed into the sea and said, 'All the ocean is my urine.'" When it came to personal relationships, they were both practical and poetic, valuing family above all. Friendship lasts a day. Kinship lasts forever. What is considered the oldest joke in the world plays with social conventions. Something that has never happened since time immemorial. A young woman has not farted in her husband's lap. It pokes fun at the idealized image of marriage and the human nature that lies beneath appearances. Another common joke works as a satire on cunning and corruption. A dog entered a tavern and said, "I see nothing. I will open this door." He pretends to be distracted, giving himself an excuse to open the door and reach his true goal. Riddles were another form of literature meant to teach abstract thinking. One of them says, "I am a field without soil, whose harvest is death, and whose plow is time. What am I?" The answer is the river. It describes its power to bring life with its floods, but also to bring death. Chapter 15. Food, the fuel of civilization. With 50,000 souls, Uruk could only exist with a constant supply of energy. At the center of the Sumerian diet was barley, the source of their two staple foods, bread and beer. Uruk's bread, or ninda, was a flat, dense loaf made from wholemeal flour ground by hand. Beer was considered a vital necessity. In the hymn to Ninkasi, the goddess of beer, its creation is described with reverence. "You are the ones who pours out the beer from the collector vat, and it is like the roar of the Tigris and Euphrates. O Ninkasi, you are the one who satisfies the heart and gladdens the soul." This drink was safer than the contaminated water of the canals and provided essential calories. It was thick and cloudy, unfiltered, and filled with bits of grain, yeast, and husks. People shared large ceramic jars, drinking from them with long reed straws. Beer was so essential that it became Sumer's liquid currency. Wages were paid in rations of bread and beer. Sweetness came from the date palm. Its sticky, energy-rich fruit was eaten fresh or dried. Protein for common people came from the waters of the Euphrates. Fish, dried and salted, was a dietary cornerstone. The treasures of their gardens rounded out the meals: garlic, leeks, onions, lentils, and chickpeas. The table of the elite was another world entirely. In the temples, priests and rulers ate roasted lamb, an extraordinary luxury. They enjoyed figs and pomegranates, and drank higher quality beer or even wine imported from the mountains. Their food was a display of power, proof that some stood much closer to the gods than others. Chapter 16: Sumerian Money. A potter wants to buy a basket of dates, but the farmer has no need for pots. This is the chaos of barter, a system that works in a small village but not in a great city. For the world's first civilization to grow, it needed to invent a universal language of value: money. The first solution was barley. Everyone needed it. It was easy to measure. It could arrive divided. Wages were paid in grain and beer. For example, 60 liters of barley for a month's work. But this grain currency had its problems. It spoiled, and it was heavy, making long-distance trade almost impossible. The remedy was silver, a metal the Sumerians cherished as much for its rarity and beauty as for its connection to the moon. Silver was the near-perfect form of money: durable, portable, divisible, and desired by every culture. Now, the potter could pay for his dates with a small piece of silver. Gradually, temples and palaces took on the role of guarantors, stamping the silver to certify its purity. In this way, silver encouraged trade, made it possible to accumulate wealth, and gave rise to the first financial contracts. Chapter 17: The First Bankers. The first financial center in history was the temple, which combined the worship of gods with the functions of a bank and agricultural investment. If a farmer needed seeds or a new plow, the temple provided them in the form of a loan. At harvest time, the farmer was required to return the amount of grain borrowed, along with an extra payment: interest. Rates were standardized and astonishingly high, typically 33.3% for loans in barley. This entire complex credit system rested on a crucial piece of technology: the written contract. The rise of loans brought with it the burden of debt. Being trapped by it was one of the greatest tragedies for the Sumerians. To pay what he owed, a man could be forced to surrender his land, his family, or even himself as a slave. Later, private moneylenders emerged, wealthy clans who financed expeditions and lent silver to individuals. Chapter 18: The Grave Problems of Uruk. The intensive agriculture that had worked the miracle of Uruk began to take its toll on the land. The worst problem was salinization. When irrigation water evaporated under the heat, it left behind a white crust of salt. Century after century, the poison accumulated, and fertile land turned barren. It was the first large-scale ecological crisis in history. To this was added deforestation. The thirst for timber to build temples and fuel kilns disrupted the ecosystem. Inside the walls, population density made the streets the perfect ground for the spread of disease. The problem of overpopulation in the city was so real and pressing that the Sumerians expressed it in their myths. In the poem Atrahasis, the gods decided to send the flood because they could no longer endure the disorder caused by humanity. The land had expanded and the people had multiplied. The god Enlil grew angry at the clamor. He could not sleep, and he said to the great gods, "The noise of humanity has become unbearable. Let us put an end to them." Uruk's prosperity carried a cost. Grain was concentrated in the temples and ended up in the hands of a few, creating inequality. For Sumerian theology, the fertile fields belonged to the city's god, and the temple managed them in his name. Though the share varied, it is estimated that peasants gave the temple 33% or even 50% of what they harvested. This meant that for most Sumerians, life was a routine of exhausting labor in exchange for basic rations. Prosperity bred envy, and competition for vital resources such as land and water grew fierce. Other city-states began to rise, imitating Uruk's model, and war became inevitable. Chapter 19: The Rise of the City-States. The revolution of Uruk spread across Mesopotamia. New cities emerged, each with its own pride and ambition. Ur rose in the south, a great trading port under the protection of the moon god Nana. Kish, to the north, was remembered in the Sumerian king list as the first city to receive divine kingship after the flood. That reputation gave it legendary prestige. The title King of Kish became a symbol of political strength and earthly power. In south-central Mesopotamia, the cities of Lagash and Umma grew face to face, locked in disputes over the same lands. Amid so many rivalries, one city stood apart, neutral and sacred: Nippur, the center of divine power. It was a kind of Sumerian Vatican. To truly rule, one had to secure sacred approval there. The growing tension among cities gave birth to a new figure, the Lugal, a great man, a warrior king. He was a charismatic leader, a military strategist whose authority was forged through victory and upheld by the loyalty of his army. Over time, this role, which began as a temporary function in times of crisis, evolved into a hereditary monarchy. When too many cities laid claim to the same land, ambition turned into conflict. The first war in history was about to begin. Chapter 20: The First War in History. I, Enetum, have crushed the city of Umma. I have heaped their corpses in 20 places. The Stela of the Vultures. Peace in Sumer was always fragile. Competition for land made it inevitable that conflict would erupt into open war. The first war described in detail was the fierce struggle between Lagash and Umma, about 4,500 years ago. The cause of the dispute was the plain of Guedin, rich and fertile. To hold it meant prosperity, to lose it meant hunger. For generations, the conflict had been managed with agreements. A border was drawn and a stone stele raised to mark it. But the king of Umma, Ush, broke the pact, invaded the field, and tore down the stela. For the new ruler of Lagash, a young and ambitious warrior king named Inatum, this was a direct challenge to his power. Inatum led his troops in a formation never before seen, a phalanx of heavy infantry. It was a wall of helmets and shields, an impenetrable barrier bristling with long spears. The army of Umma, fighting in an open and chaotic style, hurled itself against this formation, but its charge was futile. The axes and spears of Umma's warriors could not reach the men of Lagash, protected behind their wall of shields. Instead, they were pierced by a forest of spears projecting outward. It became a methodical execution. The lines of Umma broke apart in panic, but Inatum pursued and destroyed them, including King Ush himself. On the Stela of the Vultures, a stone monument commemorating Lagash's victory, it is written, "In the fields they claimed, I now water the land not with water, but with the blood of my enemies. Their bones whiten the plain." Inatum forced Anakale, the new king of Umma, to cede the land to Lagash and deliver an enormous tribute of grain. From this age of wars arose victors and vanquished, but also a chilling tale that transformed one man into legend. Chapter 21: The Quest for Immortality, the Epic of Gilgamesh. What happened when the deeds of kings turned into legend? That was the fate of the most famous Sumerian ruler, Gilgamesh. For a long time, he was seen only as a legendary figure, though today scholars agree he was a real king. All evidence suggests Gilgamesh was a powerful ruler who governed Uruk around 4,700 years ago. After his death, storytellers began recounting his great exploits to entertain the royal court. On clay tablets, scribes added mythical elements to justify his overwhelming power. He was 2/3 god and 1/3 man. At first, these were isolated poems about his adventures, but around 3,800 years ago, a Babylonian scribe wove them together into one grand epic. Thus took shape the Epic of Gilgamesh, the first great literary work of humanity, immortalized in clay. The story begins with King Gilgamesh, a tyrant who abuses his people with cruelty. Gilgamesh leaves not the son with his father. Day and night his arrogance grows. He spares not the maiden with her mother, nor the warrior's daughter, nor the nobleman's wife. To stop him, the gods create Enkidu, but from their clash with one another is born an unbreakable friendship. They fought in the public square, they grappled like wild bulls, and then Gilgamesh bent his knee. His fury subsided. They turned away from each other, and in doing so, sealed their bond of friendship. Together, now heroes, they seek eternal glory by defeating the monster Umbaba and the Bowl of Heaven. But their triumph enrages the gods, who decree that one of them must die. The chosen one is Enkidu. The death of his friend shatters Gilgamesh. For the first time, the king faces an enemy he cannot defeat. I wept for him 7 days and 7 nights. The fate of my friend has fallen upon me, and I too will die and lie beneath the earth forever. Overcome with fear, Gilgamesh abandons his kingdom and sets out on a journey to find the secret of eternal life. Must I die too? Anguish has entered my heart. I fear death, and so I wander the desert. Eventually, he meets Suduri, a tavern keeper who counsels him to embrace life's fleeting joys. Gilgamesh, where do you wander? A life you seek, you'll never find. Fill your belly. Rejoice day and night. Let your clothes be clean. Bathe in water and gaze tenderly at the child who takes your hand. Later, guided by Ur-Shanabi, the boatman, Gilgamesh crosses the waters of death to a distant shore. Here dwells Utnapishtim, the only immortal man, survivor of the Great Flood. But Utnapishtim gives Gilgamesh a harsh lesson. The true condition of humanity is mortality. Do we build a house to last forever? The gods set death in life, but they did not reveal the day of death. As a final chance, Gilgamesh finds a plant that restores youth, but a serpent steals it away. He returns to Uruk, defeated, yet with a revelation. True immortality is found in the works that endure. Chapter 22. The First Empire. Sargon the Conqueror. The old order of warring kingdoms would be swept away by a man remembered for millennia, Sargon, the founder of the First Empire. Northern Sumer was a region where a different people, the Akkadians, had long lived alongside the Sumerians. They spoke Akkadian, a Semitic language, yet had absorbed many Sumerian traditions and customs. From this world emerged Sargon. Legend tells that he was the secret son of a priestess. She placed him in a basket and set him afloat on the Euphrates, where the current carried him until a gardener found him and raised him as his own. He rose to become a servant of the king of Kish, until he rebelled with cunning and opened the path to his own greatness. From these humble beginnings, Sargon founded his own capital, Akkad, which became the center of his power. His rival was the Sumerian king Lugal-Zagezi of Umma, who had unified the cities of Sumer under his rule. Sargon commanded a combined army, with archers to weaken the enemy from afar and light fast infantry to strike decisively. After crushing Lugal-Zalgezi's forces, he conquered every one of the great Sumerian cities, from Ur to Lagash. Sargon understood that he could not rule an empire by force alone, so instead of destroying Sumerian culture, he embraced it. One of his most brilliant decisions was to adopt cuneiform writing and use it to record his own language, Akkadian. His figure became so legendary that he set the model for all future emperors of Mesopotamia. But no empire lasts forever. What Sargon built through blood and cunning would, in time, begin to fracture. Chapter 23: The Fall of the Akkadian Empire and the Rise of the Gutians. Gutium, the dragon of the mountains, filled Sumer with wickedness, seized the kingship of the land by force, and tore the wife from the man who had a wife. Official text of King Utu-Engal of Uruk. The Sumerian cities never fully accepted being ruled from the new and arrogant capital of Akkad. The breaking point came with Naram-Sin, grandson of Sargon, who dared to proclaim himself a living god. For the Sumerian worldview, this was intolerable blasphemy. To them, a king was a servant of the gods, never their equal. Long droughts devastated crops, plunging the cities into a climate of growing unrest. The final blow came from the Gutians, nomads who descended from the Zagros Mountains and struck the empire. For nearly a century, Mesopotamia was subject to these invaders, a period the tablets describe as a dark age. To Sumerian and Akkadian scribes, the Gutians were the embodiment of chaos, a barbarian people. A text from the time, known as the Curse of Akkad, describes them with palpable fear. Enlil, in his fury, brought them down from the mountains. They are not part of the land of Sumer. They are a people who know nothing of government. The rule of the Gutians never formed a solid empire. Their kings acted from the shadows, keeping the region unstable. But with the collapse of centralized Akkadian power, the old Sumerian cities began to regain their autonomy. The Sumerian spirit of independence was reborn and found its leader in a king of Uruk, Utu-Engal, who around 2120 BC rose in rebellion. He raised an army and defeated the last Gutian king, Tiragan, bringing their rule to an end in a swift war. Freedom had returned to the Sumerian lands. Utu-Engal's victory restored power to the cities. Chapter 24: The Sumerian Renaissance, the Glory of Ur. The expulsion of the Gutians was a moment of collective euphoria. The Sumerians were free once again. But unity was absent. The liberated city-states still pursued their own ambitions and projects. It was in this chaos that an astute general arose in Ur, Ur-Nammu, a man of remarkable political skill. He established himself as the new king of Sumer, founding the third dynasty of Ur with ambitions both to conquer and to build. His reign marked the beginning of a renaissance, the last golden age of Sumerian civilization. Ur-Nammu's crowning project, the jewel of his new empire, was the great ziggurat of Ur. Dedicated to Nana, the moon god, it was an artificial mountain built with millions of mud bricks. At its summit stood a small temple, the earthly dwelling of a god, a place where heaven and earth touched. Yet, the most remarkable achievement of this dynasty was the Code of Ur-Nammu, a surprisingly advanced legal code. With eloquence that still resonates after 4,000 years, it declared its mission: that the orphan should not fall prey to the wealthy, that the widow should not fall prey to the powerful. Sumerian justice under Ur-Nammu was based on monetary compensation rather than vengeance. If a man breaks another man's foot in a fight, he shall pay 10 shekels of silver. If a man breaks another man's bone with a club, he shall pay 1 mina of silver. Crimes such as murder, theft, or rape, however, were considered so serious they were punishable by death. And when evidence was unclear, the Sumerians turned to the gods through the trial of the river. In a witchcraft case without witnesses, the accused was thrown into the waters of the Euphrates. It was believed that the river god acted as a supreme judge. If the person sank, they were guilty. If they floated, they were declared innocent. The empire that Ur-Nammu founded was perfected by his son, Shulgi, who reigned for nearly 50 years. Shulgi was a diplomatic king. Under his rule, the Empire of Ur became the most centralized state in the ancient world. The true engine of the empire was a network of scribes, whose administrative work kept everything running efficiently. It allowed the state to plan the economy, mobilize labor, and maintain strict control over its domains. The Sumerian Renaissance was splendid, but like a flame burning too brightly, it was destined to die out in dramatic fashion. Chapter 25: When the Gods Abandoned the Sumerians. The price of grain has risen to 60 times its normal value. How am I to pay my guards? How can I feed the people of Ur who are dying in the streets? And you deny me the only help I ask of you? Letter of Sin, king of Ur. The strength of the Sumerian system lay in its centralization, but within that very foundation was also the seed of its destruction. From the west, across the Syrian desert, waves of semi-nomadic tribes, known as the Amorites, arrived. This continuous migration destabilized the empire and forced it to spend vast resources building defensive walls. From the east, in the mountains of what is now Iran, rose an even greater threat: the Elamites. They were an ancient civilization and a military rival, who, upon seeing the cracks in the Ur-III Empire, waited for the right moment to strike. Meanwhile, the land itself turned against them, 2,000 years of cultivation had salted the fields beyond recovery. The soil could no longer produce the grain needed to feed the population and sustain the state bureaucracy. Clay tablets from the time record catastrophically low harvests and terrible famines. The governors of distant provinces, seeing the weakness of the king in Ur, declared themselves independent kingdoms. The last king of Ur, Ibisin, trapped in a besieged capital as his empire crumbled, wrote in despair, "Enlil has raised against us the Amorites, people who do not know grain, who tear down buildings, and have never known a city." The final blow came around the year 2004 BC, when Elamite armies swept through Sumer's defenses. The great capital of Ur, starving and abandoned, finally fell. What followed was a sack of apocalyptic brutality. Temples were desecrated, houses burned, and the population massacred or carried away into slavery. King Ibisin himself was captured and dragged away, never to be seen again. The fall of Ur marked the end of an era. The Sumerian people did not vanish overnight, but this was their mortal blow. Their language ceased to be spoken in the streets, surviving only among priests and scholars. Never again would the Sumerians rule their own land. Sumer, as an independent entity, had ceased to exist. Chapter 26: The Laments for the Fall of Ur. The fall of Ur was so devastating that it gave rise to one of the most desolate works in world literature, the Laments for Ur. These were dramatic poems composed by priests or scribes to express the collective grief of the Sumerian people. One passage shows how violence spared neither combatants nor civilians, neither young nor old. The enemy swung his axe. He spared not the gray-haired elder, nor the small child still at his mother's breast. Another tells how the survivors were scarred by the horror, wandering aimlessly. The people who survived the slaughter roam like ghosts among the ruins. Their eyes are empty, their faces covered with dust and tears. Some of the survivors would later perish from hunger. Those whom the weapons did not reach died of famine. Hunger, like a flood, covered everything. This fragment captures the despair of the exiled forces to serve their conquerors. Those who once gave orders now take them. Those who sat on thrones now grind grain for the enemy. And finally, the overwhelming sense that the catastrophe had extinguished all hope for the future. Who will continue our lineage? Who will make offerings to our dead? Our future has been cut off at the root. Chapter 27. The Sumerian Diaspora. The surviving Sumerians fled and sought refuge in territory controlled by the Amorites. The first sign of change was that in the streets, markets, and homes, the Sumerian language ceased to be spoken. The identity of the Sumerian people began to dissolve, yet it was preserved in one place where it would become eternal: the school. The new Amorite kings needed to prove that they were the heirs of the glorious civilization they had replaced. For this reason, they sponsored the academies of scribes, the Adubas, which became conservatories of Sumerian culture. The Babylonians and Assyrians adopted Sumerian gods almost entirely. The Code of Hammurabi, written 3 centuries later, was deeply influenced by Sumerian legal principles. The model of the Sumerian king, warrior, lawgiver, and priest became the ideal that every king of Babylon sought to emulate. From the Sumerian astronomical legacy, Babylonian scholars built their prestige as the great astronomers of antiquity. Thus, the Sumerians lost their kingdom, but their culture became the foundation for the civilizations that followed. Chapter 28. The Rise of Babylon. After the fall of Sumer 4,000 years ago, few paid attention to a small Amorite city, Babylon. It lay in a uniquely strategic spot, where the Tigris and Euphrates run closest to each other. Control over Babylon meant mastery of the trade routes to Syria and the region's irrigation system. Its early kings understood the importance of the site. They built walls and secured control of the waters. The local god of Babylon was then a minor and almost unknown deity named Marduk. But Babylonian priests began composing new hymns that gave Marduk a far greater role. They proclaimed him son of Enki, tying him to the revered Sumerian tradition in a clear campaign of religious propaganda. The decisive moment came with King Hammurabi. When he was crowned, Babylon was still far from rivaling the great powers. To the south, the aged and mighty Rimsin of Larsa ruled over all of former Sumer. To the north, the kingdoms of Mari and Eshnunna controlled the lucrative trade routes. A lesser king might have submitted, but Hammurabi chose a different path: patience. For the first 2 decades of his reign, he was a master of diplomacy, presenting himself to other rulers as an ally. He signed pacts and watched as his rivals exhausted themselves in their own wars, while he quietly strengthened his own realm. Then Hammurabi turned to offense, conquering Larsa, Mari, and Eshnunna, until all of Mesopotamia lay under his control. Within Babylon, he reorganized the bureaucracy with the help of scribes, promoted public works, and established the famous Code of Laws. These laws served as proof that he was the king chosen by the gods. Babylon became the center of the world. Chapter 29: The Rediscovery of Sumer. The final collapse of its cities consigned the Sumerians to oblivion, their memory lost for more than 2 millennia. Great ancient historians like Herodotus, who described the wonders of Babylon, never once heard their name. In the Bible, Ur of the Chaldeans was mentioned, but no one knew who had built that city. The search began in the 19th century, when European adventurers arrived at the desolate plains of Mesopotamia. Their initial goal was to uncover later cities such as Assyria and Babylon, famed through the stories of the Bible. Explorers like the Frenchman Paul-Émile Botta and the Englishman Austin Henry Layard unearthed monumental palaces of Nineveh and Khorshabad. But alongside these treasures, they found something even more important: thousands of tablets covered in a strange script. On these tablets, Babylonian scribes spoke of an older language and a mysterious people, the Black-Headed Ones. Bilingual dictionaries and school texts were discovered, where students practiced a classical tongue, Sumerian. Archaeologists realized that beneath the ruins of Babylon and Assyria lay a mother civilization, far more ancient. Excavations moved south into Iraq, and there in places like Eridu, Uruk, and Ur, the lost world of Sumer began to re-emerge. It was the British archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley who, in the 1920s, revealed to the world the magnificence of this civilization. He uncovered hundreds of royal tombs at Ur, unearthed the Standard of Ur, and excavated the Ziggurat of Ur, among other extraordinary finds. Thanks to these pioneers, an entire civilization was rescued from oblivion. The first chapter of our history, lost for millennia, was finally restored.